Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's UNU-INWEH Science Talk. My name is Dr. Abraham Nomboga, and I'm thrilled to be your host today. For those of you new to UNU-INWEH Science Talks, our weekly series showcases the exciting research of UNU-INWEH. I'm pleased to share that all previous science talks are available on demand. You can watch the full 2025 series hosted by Dr. Miriam Exel on our website and YouTube channel at unu.edu/inwe/science talks. Today's talk, like all others, will be recorded and the video will be made available after the session. We'll conclude with an interactive Q&A, so please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box. Today's speaker is Professor Joyce Chija. Professor Chija engages smallholder farming households and communities on their empowerment, agency, access, and participation in food systems for food and nutrition security. At UNU-INWEH, Professor Chija contributes to research capacity building and policy dialogue on empowerment, water security for smallholders, for improved market access and food and nutrition security. Professor Chija holds PhD in food science from the University of Natal and KwaZulu-Natal and serves as professor there. Professor Chija has worked as an academic for over 23 years and served on various research and education boards and trusts. Currently, she is the director of the African Center for Food Security at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Welcome to today's Science Talk, Professor Chija. You can continue with your presentation.
Thank you very much, and greetings to my colleagues in Canada and everyone online. It's a great pleasure to share my work with you on water security at the intersections of smallholder agriculture for food and nutrition security in Southern Africa and Africa. I will begin on the first slide, please. I'll begin on the first slide just by reminding us on the importance of water security, which we all know so well, but to locate it within the smallholder farming system, the communities within which they live, and their households. As we know, water is foundational in food systems. It is required for production and for processing from an agricultural point of view. But we also know that agriculture accounts for a large percentage of the global freshwater withdrawals, up to 70%. On the other hand, only 3% of renewable water is used, largely due to poor infrastructure, but also lack of capacity and capability to using renewable water in the food system. For African agriculture, however, particularly smallholder agriculture, because African agriculture is largely smallholder, up to 60% of African agriculture relies on rain-fed agriculture, agriculture, bringing a peculiar challenge to production because it is rain-fed and lacks irrigation infrastructure. While African farmers are relying on rain-fed agriculture, they live side by side climate change, trying to adapt to increasing droughts and rainfall variability, erratic rainfall, which changes when they can plant, how they can plant, and who can actually plant in this difficult climate. And yet we know that it is these smallholders, up to 80% of them, that produce food for their households. And in the rest of Africa, it can be even up to 90% in other regions. So it's very important for livelihoods and for food production. But that's not where the story ends, because when water is scarce, it limits food production, but it goes further and affects the value chain, but also affects human life, livelihoods at a very detrimental point of nutrition. Often nutrition impacts that are negative are difficult or even impossible to undo once, particularly, the child hasn't received all the micronutrients they needed during the correct window of their growth. So it has detrimental impact. It's not just water being scarce, but it is how it is affecting livelihoods and other processes of human development. There's been a lot of studies about what are the determinants of this water security. Some of these determinants speak to poor performance of infrastructure, lack of water licenses where they are required, but particularly the absence of the very same farmers, their households and communities where management of this water is required. They have been found by many studies to be missing in decision-making, in participation, and therefore decisions are often made for them by policymakers from far away to where they actually farm. It's also linked to the fact that many smallholder farmers do not have secure land tenure because the land and the water are tied to food production. We can move to the next slide, please. Since it is so important, this water security, what is it? What is our understanding about it? We know what water is and how important it is to food production, but this concept of water security, what is it? What do we understand about it and how does it mirror food security and also impacting nutrition security? There are many definitions, but for today's purpose, we will rely on this definition that says water security is the reliable availability of acceptable quality and quantity of water for livelihoods and production systems. It is the backbone of agricultural production, as we've just discussed, but not just that, but actually for human and animal life. Just like the food security concept, water security also can be understood in terms of various pillars. These pillars can be agreed to be availability. So when we speak of water security, we talk about water being available. It is available not only for production, but along the whole value chain of production. So from production, from the farm, but also in the processes that are involved in value addition and processing all the way to the value chain, the markets, and ultimately in the household and on the plate. So available to support the whole value chain from farm to fork. It can also be understood in terms of accessibility. How accessible is this water? And this accessibility speaks to physical accessibility, where infrastructure, where physical distance is concerned, but also social accessibility. Is the water socially accessible to everyone and at all times? As we know, there are cultural and social practices that are embedded in various cultures and locations and contexts that can determine who accesses water and when. And all of this is important for water security. Another pillar that we have to think about is the quality of the water. It's one thing to have access to the water, but is it of a safe and usable quality. Because if it is not, it can have detrimental impacts, including death, particularly for young children. So it's important that the water is of a good quality, it is safe for consumption and for use. Another pillar that is important is reliability of water supply. Is the supply reliable or is it erratic? So the infrastructure may exist where taps and pipes have been laid, but when farmers and individuals turn on those taps, often they run dry. This happens in many contexts, especially in the African context. In South Africa, we have a peculiar phenomenon called water shedding. We've accepted electricity shedding, we call it load shedding, where there are periods of time where you don't have electricity. But there's now this concept called water shedding, where municipalities are using it as a way of managing supply of water to various parts of a city and localities. So reliability of water is an important concept related to this water security. Governance is another important pillar that is important for water security, where rules and management and decisions are taken to manage so that there is the availability, the supply, the quality, and the upkeep of the infrastructure that is required. When governance falls down, including the government of these aspects of water security, communities and agriculture suffers as a result. Therefore, without water security, we can agree that agricultural productivity and now nutrition outcomes become very negatively affected, because in the food system, where water security is actually a driver of many of the processes, nutrition outcomes become negative when water security is not achieved. So in other words, when we have water insecurity, down the line, we get to experience nutrition outcomes that are negative, and we will speak about them shortly. The next slide, please. So what are these intersections? How does this water, food, and nutrition interact? And what does that mean for communities, for development, for livelihood, and for the food system as a whole and the people within the food system? So in terms of the intersection, we can see that food and nutrition are dependent on water availability. The food has to be produced, so it has to be first available. However, we've now understood that if that water is not reliable, it is not available at the right time, at the right quantity, in the safe format, we can have negative outcomes of food insecurity. So the availability of this water influences many activities along the value chain of food production and throughout the whole food system, such that the outcomes of the food system can be negatively impacted when water security is not achieved. So the interactions between water, food, and nutrition, we see them at the crop productivity level, where this water security concept is very instrumental in deciding what needs to be planted. What do I mean by that? When the rain doesn't come at the right time and farmers are used to planting maize in Southern Africa around between December and January, but the rains come at the end of January. This has now pushed many of them to sometimes even miss the season, therefore not have a crop to rely on for their consumption, for market, and we can see how this is affected. We can also see the interactions where the diet is concerned. And I want to emphasize how critical this is. So when we don't have the right amount of water, we cannot produce certain crops that are not drought tolerant, particularly vegetables and other crops that need a higher quantity of water. Therefore, what we get to have on our plate is a less variety of foods. And with less variety, it means we are missing particularly the micronutrients, proteins, the vitamins that are required for growth. And this is detrimental for children under 5, particularly in the first 1,000 days of life. Very important for the mother and also the child who is growing. If this is not addressed at that window of life, at the 100 days of life, this can affect the opportunities, the abilities, cognitive abilities of that infant, and therefore, as we can see, poor performance in the school, and therefore locking that household into generational poverty. We can also see how water is important for livestock production, including animal health. Currently in South Africa and Southern Africa, we are battling the foot and mouth disease, where our markets are affected because no one will take our beef and animal products because of that challenge. Part of this is water is important for animal health, including controlling other diseases, not only FMD. During the dipping cycles, many of the dippings rely on water for the animals to pass through and receive that medication to control disease. So we can see how important this is, and also for food markets, including availing variety of products, as I've mentioned before, but also in the processes of how food is processed, in value addition, and finally in the household. In households where water is not reliable or safe water is not common, this can be detrimental, such that food may be well produced, but the way it is prepared, cleaned, if that water is infected, that household can end up in negative health outcomes, including being sick, particularly for children and the elderly who have weaker immune systems. The next slide, please. This is how we can think of water security as a concept and how it mirrors the food security concept. As we said, water security, in this case, it's the opposite of water security, is when there is no water security, we therefore have water insecurity. When it leads to lower yields, what does that mean for food and nutrition security? Which pillars of food and nutrition security are affected? We can see that availability is affected, access to that food is affected, but also stability of supply is affected. And the agency of those farmers, households in the food system to actually decide what they will plant, when they will plant, that decision, that empowerment is taken away because of that lack of water. They will only produce that which can grow, that which is drought tolerant, that which survives. And we can also see that as lower yields lead to reduced food access and food quality, the food and nutrition security pillars that are affected continue to be access, availability, and utilization. And again, safety, lack of safety and also infected water have negative and detrimental outcomes to health, including death. So it's very important that we take care of this water security. And of course, as the food access and food quality is reduced, ultimately we end up with malnutrition, which is a very growing problem in Southern Africa. We start seeing this double burden where communities, farming communities, even particularly in Southern Africa, are both malnourished, both from having less food, but also having an oversupply of one type of food. So we have obesity growing on the one end, but we also have malnutrition where it is expressed as undernutrition, where children experience kwashiorkor, marasma, and all those conditions where food is scarce, but on the other hand, it's one type of food, particularly macronutrients, that are consumed to overcompensate for the lack of variety of protein and other micronutrients in the system. So we are experiencing both challenges, and this is a burden, a great burden on the health purse of the countries, and also on the productivity of a nation and innovation, and having enough skills and people who can be innovative, who can achieve higher results in school. All of this is impacted, and countries remain with lower GDPs because of something as insignificant, it would seem, as nutrition. So it is that important to really see the linkages between water insecurity and ultimately the GDP of a nation via the nutrition, via our plates. The next slide, please. The next slides are going to just highlight points that we are aware of. What are the challenges? What do they look like in Southern Africa? In Southern Africa in general, we see the increasing droughts that are frequent. We see the high rainfall variations and the changing of seasons that is really putting farmers at a difficult place as they start to adapt and try to be resilient. The season shifts, their capabilities are eroded, their resilience is eroded as and when they try to shift. So it's a very wicked set of problems with climate change, food insecurity, and this water insecurity really exacerbating the conditions that were already difficult on the ground. We also see that the countries that are mostly are affected are South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Mozambique. And we see this because most of these countries in Southern Africa are countries that are water scarce in their nature. They receive lower average compared to other countries in the world in terms of rainfall. Therefore, they need to already be ahead in terms of their resilient regimes to climate change, but we know that this is not what we are experiencing on the ground. And we see that our groundwater is being underutilized because of lack of infrastructure, capacity, knowledge, and also our catchments become more and more degraded. So Southern Africa is facing a big challenge in that the 2030 goals that are set for us to achieve really are out of reach at the moment. 2030 is around the corner, and a big part of that is water insecurity. Next, please. Of course, climate change puts our water in more risk due to this intensifying water stresses, the droughts, and lower yields decreasing. And what I want to highlight here is staples such as maize continue to decline significantly. There are regions in Southern Africa that are stopping production of maize, particularly smallholder regions, and yet it remains a staple. Then we really need to come up with solutions on what are the other crops that are more resilient to these changing and more restrictive water availability in the region, so that we can continue to have more food security and less nutrition insecurity, and that we can have more climate resilient water management capacity and capabilities in the region. This will take a set of multi-stakeholders working together for shared goals and shared value. Next slide, please. A very important point to record and labor on about Southern Africa is the issue of gender and how it plays out in water insecurity and the smallholder farming system. Most of the farmers in Southern Africa remain to be female, particularly for crop production, and crop production that is used largely by the household. We do see less of them in animal production because of cultural values where animals are often seen as the male's domain of agriculture. The cattle, we do see less females, some females in smaller livestock, but for crop production, it is largely female dominated. So because females are already burdened with household productivity chores, they tend to only go a certain level in terms of water management. They manage household water, but agricultural water, we tend to see less of them being involved in management and community leadership where water that is shared by the community. But at the household level, we see them. They produce the food crops, they maintain household nutrition, particularly the variety of the food and the diet that is required, the green leafy vegetables that are so required in the diet, they tend to be the ones leading in the production of those crops. But there's a challenge with women being so heavily burdened with producing the food out of the home in the fields, and also turning the food into nutrition on our plate, and taking care of children and all their other care work outside of the home. So they have a serious time poverty and require a way where stakeholders work together so that the men themselves tend to be more visible in the space. It is the women that are heavily involved, as I've said, but they are the very same ones who have poor access to land, limited irrigation technology use. We see less and less of women where irrigation and technology is involved, and also limited decision-making powers. What does this mean? It means gender inequality truly reduces agricultural productivity and food security at these community spaces. So it's important when we think about policies, programs, and stakeholders working together for common benefits, we think about how gender is understood and works in very specific contexts. It's not the same everywhere else. It's about understanding the context and using the context to bring everyone on board. Next slide, please. What does this mean then for policy and institutions that are involved in water security work? Water and agriculture policies often, as we see, they often function in a separate way. They function in silos where agricultural people often don't talk to water people, and yet there is no agriculture without water. And therefore, there are specific gaps that we see. We see one of the gaps being in poor integration of the water, agriculture, and nutrition policies. These policies need to be talking to one another, but also financed and implemented in programs that are long-lasting and making an impact on the ground. But this is a weakness of how these policies are integrated or less integrated. This therefore leads to limited investment in these spaces, particularly in smallholder irrigation. There's limited investment in the space, and yet should it be better invested in, there is great benefit both for nutrition diversity, but also for surplus that can be produced, and for income and small markets and local economic generation because of that irrigation. We see the fragmentation at an institutional level and poor coordination. Therefore, there is a need for policy to be more integrated across all sectors and to create programs and not separated policies on the ground. Next slide, please. This vision in front of us is a small field in an irrigation research field somewhere in the province of South Africa in Limpopo. It is a small field where many smallholder farmers share cropping in an irrigation scheme. So they do have access to water. They do have access to land, even though it is decreasing in number. And yet we continue to see challenges. We continue to see hunger. We continue to see poor management, even though there's irrigation. So what is the challenge? What is the problem? The problem seems to be the lack of integration between policymakers, even at a community level. Also, social issues coming into play in terms of gender and culture, who manages the water, the flow of the water, who's at the beginning of the field and who has the downstream, who's not receiving the water on time. So many challenges such that these irrigation schemes struggle with managing themselves even when there is irrigation. Therefore, we continue to see, according to the Global Hunger Index, water security being central to the fact that global hunger remains. There has been an improvement between 2016 and now, but it has stagnated. Where it has gone higher, this hunger index, it's where there is conflict. So we see that conflict on top of climate change remains a threat in agricultural production, and they continue to drive hunger. So at a global scale, we see that indeed, water insecurity becomes a driver to increasing food and nutrition insecurity. And therefore, we need to work even harder at a global scale on Africa and Southern Africa to have programs that reduce these impacts of conflict, undernutrition, and also to deal better with climate change and help our farmers to become more resilient so that the food system itself can produce better nutrition for the communities that are involved. Next slide, please. So what are the solutions if we have so many challenges? We could look to indigenous knowledge systems and how water has been managed in these indigenous knowledge systems. We can look to how they provide solutions in terms of rainwater harvesting, what is known, what works. There's a lot of research in these spaces. In a country like South Africa, we have the Water Research Commission and similar science councils in Southern Africa and on the continent, where there is a lot of research that is already being done. So why are we not implementing these local and indigenous knowledge systems in terms of managing rainwater and harvesting techniques that exist? Bringing back indigenous drought-resistant crops, what we've termed negatively orphan crops, we now call them opportunity crops. Those are important to bring on board so that our food systems can have a better outcome of food and nutrition security, better diversity, better food availability, and even improved markets as we start to sell and eat more of these so-called old crops or orphan crops. But they bring an opportunity to our problems today, hence the opportunity crop name. Also look to traditional governance systems, study how they've worked, and see how we can bring on board that knowledge system where communities are already in agreement. That's what works in those context-specific solutions, and bring them on board. But we're not implementing knowledge from this system of knowledge. So we need to look to that as well. So of course, these opportunity crops could be millet, sorghum, cowpea, a wide variety of green leafy vegetables in Southern Africa that are known, but it's very difficult to get hold of them today because that food system has been really neglected. Therefore, to strengthen it from the seed system of those crops and strengthen it along the whole value chain where water is needed, but often less water is needed, and these crops are tolerant to droughts and the conditions in the region. So they offer us some solutions. Next screen, please. Further on possible solutions, we need to use technologies that are suitable and appropriate for smallholder farmers. Irrigation systems that are used by large-scale monocropping systems may not be suitable at a small scale. So it's about the appropriateness and the effectiveness and the affordability at a small scale level. We can even look to solar-powered irrigation pumps. We can look to drip irrigation, rainwater harvesting, farm ponds, and storage systems that will benefit us in terms of pushing our yields up and multiplying our crop seasons. Now, when we rely on rain, we wait for a rainy season. Once it has passed, we've got only one season in the year for many of our crops. And this will also assist us with diversifying the diet, which improves our nutrition security, improves capability, cognitive development in our children, and therefore innovation and children who can handle demanding subjects like mathematics and last longer in school. Their energy, they can store information longer and not have sugar crashes when they eat foods that are cheap and just spike their sugar and not really learn well in school. We can do better with really focusing on some of the crops that are available in Southern Africa through appropriate technologies. Next slide, please. What is the role of research institutions like ourselves today? What is our role in addressing some of these issues? Our role, yes, is to do the research, to develop models that work, that are efficient in the farming systems, efficient but also appropriate. But also those models need to be context specific. They need to be well studied to fit and work in various contexts, because we could have wonderful innovations, but if they are not well thought out for specific context, their uptake may be low or even detrimental because of lack of understanding various contexts. But beyond that, I'm even urging us to say, let's look to translating existing research that is already published, that is already there and tested, to implement in the implementation, which is translating that science. And translation science is a science on its own. In translating that science, many of us can study how communities actually uptake these technologies. What do we need to change? Working with these communities, we can learn from them on how they actually change and shift how they do things, and publish on those models of how communities actually uptake technology and science. We can do more research in indigenous crops, in community-based water management systems, and also on policy-relevant research, and not just research that is nice to have, but more and more of our research to be relevant to development needs. Next slide, please. What are the implications for sustainability and shared benefits if we get to work in this way? We will improve food and nutrition security. We will enhance resilience to climate change. We will strengthen rural livelihoods and more urban livelihoods that actually need attention from us as well. We will improve sustainable resource management, because complex challenges require all of us to work in multidisciplinary teams, but also to work transdisciplinary as well in order to address agricultural production challenges, the economics, hydrology, nutrition, and climate adaptation sectors, knowledge streams, working together to be innovative at a policy level with one goal: to improve this water security. Next slide, please. So how do we conclude on this bag of complexity and yet a farming system that needs us to work as teams that can share in the benefits of research, community engagement, and ultimately impact and addressing food insecurity? We can conclude that water security is central to smallholder agriculture. We can conclude that it is the integrated approaches that will foster these core benefits, these benefits for all of us, that this way of working is critical. We can conclude that ourselves as research institutions, we need to support, but we need the support, but also the reward of our institutions when we work in a transdisciplinary way and in an interdisciplinary way. Often institutions are speaking louder now on working as transdisciplinary teams, interdisciplinary teams, but the institutions themselves haven't often changed to support, to provide the correct platforms, the centers, the institutes within our spaces in order to do this work and to actually resource this kind of work. So there's a loud push also from funders, but often the institutions are lagging behind in terms of being agile enough to accommodate this urgent way of working. Integrating so that nutrition security is central to this work with all policy sectors, promoting equity, promoting inclusion, localization of our approaches, and also diversity in what we do are all important aspects of how we can do the work better. It will help us to strengthen water management at various contexts in order to improve the food systems and for better nutrition outcomes. But we need capacity building and empowerment, not only of the researchers, but of the communities and the smallholder farming systems that we work with in order for them to transform and learn how to collaborate with each other. All in all, if we do this, we will improve in climate smart and nutrition sensitive agriculture. Next slide, please. As I've concluded, these are the references that I consulted to prepare this talk. As I finish, I just really want to emphasize that it will take us working together, but not just as talk, actually breaking down our barriers, our walls, working together with communities in order to address these complex issues, in order for water security to yield food and nutrition security. And I'd like to leave you with the understanding that without water security, we won't have nutrition security for the vulnerable communities. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Professor Chija, for the insightful presentation. We'll now move to our Q&A, and for our online audience, you can post your questions in the Q&A box. I'll like to start this conversation. As someone growing up in sub-Saharan Africa, your presentation reminded me of so many intersectional problems that we faced. But you made this profound statement that gender inequality reduces agricultural productivity and food security. And you've engaged in rural communities or local communities for a number of years. Could you tell us some of the practical solutions that could help reduce gender inequality when it comes to food security?
Thank you for this very difficult question. There is no simple answer, but from what we have learned it's to really understand the context within which we work. First, accepting that you don't know everything, that the community has its own rules and embedded cultural practices that make it function. Understanding those, but also finding ways in which within those cultures, where there are pockets or ideas and practices that actually support women, and finding who the leaders and the champions for those ways of working are. I have found that if you identify these, particularly if they are men, and you want to address a female oriented problem, for example, in one of the research projects that we worked in, of course, it was the females who were working a lot more. So we did a time survey with both men and women. And in the time survey, we asked the men, what do you do from 6 a.m. when you wake up to 6 p.m. when you are back in the home? We found that the men really struggled to explain what they were doing with the time. It was fluid, but for the females, they had a clear understanding of how and what they did from the time they woke up, because they had this heavy burden on them. And we started saying to the men, okay, so if you are the head of the household, what does that mean? It means to protect, it means to look after your children. How about if your wife is up in the morning to go tend for the vegetable garden because you need it? Would it really be a terrible thing to get the children ready to school and walk them? So we worked on that protective aspect of being a man, holding your child and walking them to the school as it was understood in that context. And we found more agreement and collaboration to say, yes, I can protect my child, walk them to school while my wife is busy in the fields. So it's about understanding the context, working with the context, and identifying pockets where you can have collaboration from those that seem like they're opposing, but it's lacking the examples of who's doing it in the village. And once an activity is uptaken by more and more of the people who were not doing it before, that's when we started seeing a bit of a shift. So it's not an easy answer. It is understanding the context and finding champions to work alongside.
Thank you. Still on that strand of conversation, Sogo said, dear Prof, excellent talk. Thank you for highlighting the role of women in agriculture. What can international organizations do to support women in this sector? And how can we empower women in the community and create spaces for them in decision-making?
Again, I think our interest for all of us is really the household. And to also highlight that women don't exist on their own. They exist with men, and they have boy children in their households. So it really is about taking everyone along the journey of empowerment. So empowering the women, there needs to be a program that also empowers the men so that the women can do better in the agriculture and have less of a time burden, but the men can also step in on certain activities that align with how they identify their power and who they are within their community. Perhaps they can be more involved in the irrigation activities, in the infrastructure activities. So it's about empowering everyone and not isolating the women and empowering her alone, because doing that, there's been enough studies showing that it really creates an imbalance, because it's about power and who and how that power is shared. So it's a careful understanding of the communities, but thinking of the household that will prosper. We don't want the women to prosper on their own and their households to break down during an empowerment process. So it's about taking both along the journey.
Thank you, Joyce. This is this is Grace. I really don't want to start the gender issue thing, because at this point, to 11 a.m. Canada time 2026 is tiring, to keep perpetrating this kind of narrative, that essentially is not liberating, anyone in this 21st century. So I would rather want to take a shift and ask instead that, is it possible to give us one example on the traditional water governance systems? I'm curious to see how traditionally, because it's one of the solutions you suggested. So how does it work? Those traditional water systems at a local level, how does it work? To really understand or see how it can be taken forward,
Yeah. Yes, thank you for the question. And I'll start it again by saying you have to understand the local context. We worked in an area in South Africa called Venda, where myself, whether I was called professor or not, greeting the chief as a way of entering that community, having to lie down on your side and pay homage to those traditions, but understanding that the irrigation scheme there still was mirrored by what the community lived as. So the men were in a leadership position where it was about who is opening the weir to the irrigation scheme at what time. So we found that studying the local, or if you call it local or traditional, but the local context where men would be in leadership, positional leadership, and women were more in the influential leadership, but they tended to work hand in hand when the goal was common. So it was functional because it wasn't affecting too much of what was done in the normal community. It wasn't too different to what was done in the irrigation system. So understanding the local context, working with it, but identifying champions for change. That would be the easiest way to explain the research. I can send you the work later by email. We can continue the discussion, but it was understanding the local context, having a mirror of it, and identifying the champions that will carry through the changes we were looking for. Better management, but also offloading the care work on the women and almost buying in and working more collaboratively with the men to say this kind of change was not harmful. It is actually beneficial to the household. So that's what we would call a traditional, but more local solutions, context-specific solutions is how we coined it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sharjah, Professor Sharjah, for this very useful presentation and for highlighting the water food nexus and nutrition nexus. Actually, my question is about, from your perspective, what would be the main barrier to adopt the climate smart and nutrition sensitive systems in Africa? And also from your perspective, how can the energy part be included within a bigger nexus, particularly that Africa has a long light time that can be used for solar energy and the green energy. And how do you think that reusing of wastewater can be helpful in implementing such nexuses?
Okay, so you've asked 3 questions. By recalling you saying the first one, how can African communities adapt climate smart technologies? I think that it's multifaceted. So it's about their capacity to actually do that. Education, it will take training, it will take education, but it will also take the capacity for them to be able to do that. So the technologies need to be appropriate. For example, if you say to a community, okay, you need to do more contouring on your slopes because that's how your farms are, how do they have enough manpower to actually build the ridges, to build the vetiver grass? All of whatever technology you bring in, make sure the capacity is there. So training, but also capacity. Bring in extension. Extension in the African continent and in South Africa is what is central to assisting these smallholder farmers, and bring the communities from the conception of the research problem. Do not design it on your own in your office or with your colleagues. Actually conceive it with them, take it to them, a few ideas to find out what is priority to them, so that there is a buy-in from the onset of the research, so that it becomes very action-oriented and you can intervene as you go along and build capacity throughout the research process. The issue of energy, indeed, we need solar-powered technologies that are basic but work in the African context. So we need tools, but maybe we don't need tools that are highly electronic. We just need a tool that has a basic motor that can run on solar or basic diesel or biodiesel. So the technologies that we need, we know we're now living in 5 IR, even 6 IR, but maybe some communities can still do better. They can move from point 1 to point B by operating some basic technology that they haven't been able to access. So translating what is already there, I tried to emphasize that in my talk, translating knowledge that already exists. It is there, it has been tried and tested, maybe in India, maybe in similar contexts, but it hasn't been translated in the African context. So it's about finding those and implementing them and learning how the communities uptake those technologies. I hope I've answered you. You had a few questions.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Shija, for your wonderful talk. And for those online, we look to see you again next week, Wednesday, for the next science talk. Thank you, Professor Shija, and we look forward to having you again in our future science talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
You registered the receiver?